Hi there. My name is Vladimir, which you may or may not know, but if you don't, now you do. And usually when I do my webinars, I don't show myself like this. I usually instead have a PowerPoint presentation. So maybe you don't really know my face. I'm a psychotherapist, a counselor, and a coach, and I've been doing this for over 10 years now. So I have quite a bit of experience with body-focused repetitive behaviors. And today I want to talk about resistance to change and why change tends to be so difficult and so painful. Over the past few months at the BFRB Club, I've received several questions and requests to talk a little more about this, about the challenges that changing poses. Yesterday, in addition, I was supervising a colleague because I'm also a psychotherapy supervisor. And we talked about a client who has trichotillomania. And my colleague was slightly exasperated at the kind of facing the length of treatment and the topsy-turvy nature of it, the back and forth, the progresses and the relapses and all this. And then I thought, well, if a therapist struggles with this, and therapists are kind of by demands of our profession, we're supposed to be patient people. And I thought, well, if a therapist's patience is being tested, then maybe I should make a video about this, and people have asked for it anyway, and just talk a little bit about resistance to change and generally the obstacles that people encounter when they try to change. I tried writing a blog first, but then it turned out to be very lengthy. I tried making a webinar, but then structuring it was really difficult because this is a very big area to cover. So I decided to just give up on giving any definitive structure to this. And I said to myself, well, I'm just going to turn on my webcam and talk. So here I am talking. I would like to cover three basic clusters. So it's not that this doesn't have any structure at all. Three different reasons why change is difficult, three groups of obstacles, and then I will talk about what you can do at each to resolve it or to kind of move past it as fast as you can. If there are any questions afterwards, and I assume that there will be, you can simply ask them, email me, put them in the comments below, or ask me in whatever way you have to contact me. And I would be really happy to answer and clarify, because I do understand that this will probably not be the most comprehensive overview of resistance to change and body-focused repetitive behaviors that I can imagine. And because my way of talking is, let's say, conveniently digressive, I'm probably going to say more things that I will have time to explain. So let's start with maybe the most common reasons for not changing or resisting change that I see in my everyday practice, and also the group of reasons that are the easiest to deal with. So let's call them strategic reasons. When people, because BFRBs are chronic and people struggle with them for a long time before they even know what they are, and then takes a long time to kind of deal with the shame and the stigma and to look for treatment and find someone who actually knows how to treat them. That's a long-term problem. And then obviously it's not a problem that will be resolved very quickly. Sometimes you may come, or maybe you already found yourself at this point a few times, where you suddenly feel this enthusiasm and desire to change. Maybe you're fed up with picking your skin and you want to end it now. And then you muster up the strength and you're ready to just jump in. Maybe you have a wedding in 6 months and you want to be free of hair pulling by that time. For some reason, weddings seem to be very motivating to people, their own weddings and other people's weddings too. So maybe that's what it is. And then you feel this rush of enthusiasm. You're suddenly really motivated and ready to change. And you just immediately go and say, I will stop doing it right away. And this is the first methodological error that people make. believing that if they stop right away and stop completely, that this will somehow be enough. It never is. In fact, I am a firm believer that stopping altogether right away is not the best way to deal with BFRBs. I think this is far more likely to lead to a very strong relapse, and I don't think it's a sustainable strategy in the long term, because BFRBs are stubborn, persistent, chronic. It's really difficult to just stop and never stop again, and never start again. Sorry. When you stop, what you tend to rely on is your willpower. Willpower is an expendable resource, so it'll last for, I don't know, a week, a month, couple of months, and that's it. I have seen people who start off just going cold turkey and not picking or pulling at all, and then they feel really proud of themselves and really good about themselves until that day comes when they're suddenly overpowered by the urge to pick or to pull, and then they relapse and they feel really, really bad. And they feel really helpless and kind of hopeless. And oftentimes this is when they're ready to give up changing and come up with these ideas that they'll just have to struggle with it forever and it'll never get better. So if your strategy is to quit cold turkey and just never pull or never pick again, this right away is an error. It's very likely not going to work. It doesn't matter the kind of support system you have. Willpower is simply not a sustainable way to create psychological change. Willpower is extremely useful when we need a nudge, a little push, but it's not something that you can rely on day in and day out. It simply does not work that way. So that's the first methodological or strategic error that I see. The second one is that people will just jump in and try to find a replacement behavior for their picking or their pulling. But they will just do so based on what works for other people or what seems like it might work for them. This is an issue because when you want to replacing your picking or your pulling with another habit, so introducing what's called a competing response in habit reversal training, is a good way to deal with the habitual behavioral aspect of the problem. We have plenty of studies at this point that say that habit reversal training is an effective way to deal with body-focused repetitive behaviors. So we know it works. However, habit reversal training has its own steps. So there's a procedure that you roughly have to follow. The first stage of this procedure is not introduce replacement habits, find your competing response. The first stage is awareness training. It means observe yourself, write down all sorts of information about your problem so that you understand every little facet of it, so that you become aware of what's happening, right? So this is really necessary and it's very important. At the same time, this is a stage that people very frequently like to skip. What I hear from my clients or people in the BFRB Club is that they will say something like, oh, well, I'm introspective enough, or I'm very self-aware, or I'm a reflective person, I'm very mindful. I really don't need to spend all these weeks observing my own behavior and learning about my own behavior. Instead, I'm just going to go ahead and skip this, and I'm going to choose my competing response based on my remarkable level of self-awareness that I already have. I'm saying this with a slight tinge of irony, in case you can't tell. And this is because no one actually has that level of self-awareness. If we were all self-aware to that extent, then we would find a solution for whatever troubles us. Usually when we have a problem, it means that we have some blind spots there. When you want to choose a competing response to replace your picking or your pulling, you want to be very methodical about that. So you need to know where. So every strategy has its range of convenience. So in other words, every strategy is useful in some areas, in some places, in some situations, and it's not useful in others. So you need to know where you pick or pull and where you don't. What triggers it? Where your BFRB tends to be mindless, unconscious, and where it's focused, where you're absolutely aware of what you're doing. You want to know if you ever do it in front of other people or not. You need to know what triggers it, what thoughts or feelings precede it, what happens during it, and what happens after you pick or after you pull. There's a lot of information that you need to learn before you can actually choose a strategy that works. One strategy can work for 99 people out of 100, and you can be that one person that this strategy is not good for. And the only way for you to know is if you do your awareness training well. A strategy needs to be chosen rationally, not based on what seems cool or what works for most people. It's convenient and it's useful to see what works for most people because it'll give you good ideas and it'll help you learn more about yourself. But in order to choose a replacement habit that actually works, you have to know your specific circumstances very well. So skipping awareness training is always a strategic mistake that will cost you eventually. Another error that people make is how, even if they choose a good replacement habit, is how they choose to implement it. The thing with BFRBs is that they have not just an emotional component and resistance to change in that department, I'll talk about in just a minute. They have this habitual component, right? They are repetitive behaviors. For something to become a habit, it needs to be repeated hundreds, thousands, millions of times. If you've struggled with picking for, let's say, 10 years, do you know how many times you have to repeat that before it became an actual problem for it to become habitual and repetitive? Right? And then you have 10 years of solidifying a habit to add to the original problem of forming it as a habit. So a lot of repetition went into maintaining and creating a problem. That means that when you want to replace it with something else, you are going to need a lot of practice. You're going to need repetition, and it needs to be targeted, needs to be intentional, needs to be specific. You can't select a competing response. Like, for example, you can't say, here, I'll use this worry stone, then buy it and just toss it on the table and never use it again. You need to implement it strategically. You need to practice it. You need to be intentional about when you will need to use it. If you don't implement your competing response with a sustainable strategy, it will fail. Another reason why people have difficulties changing is that they expect change to go smoothly. They don't plan for failure. And I have to say, and I'm sorry that I have to say this so bluntly, but unless you're willing to fail, it simply won't get better. Failure is kind of an integral part of the process. A competing response, let's say, may seem like a brilliant, wonderful, perfect solution, but you will still fail while you're implementing it. It will never be 100% effective. So you will have to kind of accept in advance that failure will be a part of the process. And then whenever you fail, instead of letting that go to waste and feeling bad about yourself, the best thing that you can do is learn about the failure and learn from the failure. See, why is it that this failed in this particular instance? Do you need to modify the strategy? Were the circumstances simply extraordinary and not something that will happen routinely? Do you need to introduce another competing response in a specific situation? So if you think that failure shouldn't happen, right there you have a belief that will cause resistance further on. Another thing that people like to do is to choose 15 or 5 or 6 competing responses. As I said previously, establishing new habits is painfully difficult. That means that one habit is hard to establish. How hard do you think it is to establish 5 habits at the same time? It's not only hard, it's borderline impossible. So if you try too many things at once, you will probably fail. So these are all kind of strategic errors. There's another thing that I would like to throw into the mix at this level, at least, which is impatience. People somehow form these arbitrary ideas, like I need to reduce my picking by 50% in a month, or I need to reduce my picking by 80% in a month and a half. Actually, just this morning, I had a session with a client who said, well, at this point in the treatment, I should be picking far less than I'm picking now. And then I asked, okay, but how did you decide, how much you should be picking at what point? And the client just shrugged her shoulders and said, I don't know, it just seems that way. So we have these arbitrary musts and shoulds that don't really take into account how we change naturally. Whenever that happens, again, failure is bound to happen. So don't set yourself up for failure. Be strategic. See how you usually change. In the past, what was realistic for you to achieve? And then start with that. I like to say start with 10% reduction per week. This is, I will give you that, also a very random number, but it is a random number that seems to work, at least in my experience as a therapist. So there is that part. Now, with this, there's a lot more that I could say here, but this video will then be very, very long, and I'm already staring at myself for quite a while now. I really would prefer not to, so let's end this section here. So these are methodological errors. These are things that are relatively easy to correct once you identify them. Patience is a skill, discipline is a skill. There are procedures. I have a whole webinar on this that you can check out. It's the first of the BFRB Club webinars, and it'll guide you through habit reversal training. So these errors are usually easy to correct because you can try different strategies and one of them will work. The second group of issues with change and issues that cause resistance to change that I would like to talk about is when you try to get rid of a problem, in this case, skin picking, hair pulling, or some other BFRB, and you do so by not really providing yourself with a backup. And I don't mean a replacement habit here. I'm talking about something more complex. Namely, and this may not be an idea that sits well with everyone, but oh well, I'd be happy to debate you on that. Every symptom has a function. In other words, we don't just randomly adopt behaviors that cause problems for us. For a behavior to become habitual, it has to do something for us. And BFRBs do something. They provide a distraction sometimes. They have self-soothing properties. So they do something for us. If you need self-soothing, let's stick with that one because this is common enough. And your hair pulling, for example, is the only way in which you can soothe yourself, then you will have a really hard time giving up hair pulling, because that means that by proxy, you will be giving up self-soothing. While hair pulling is obviously a problem, self-soothing isn't the problem. It's actually a very natural, normal thing that we all need sometimes. I also need self-soothing, but I will use some of my mindfulness-based techniques that I've learned and used over the past 20 years, and they work really well for me. When we grow up, as we're growing up, rather, we learn how to self-soothe. If the only thing you came up with results in a body-focused repetitive behavior, then giving up that behavior is not going to be easy. But in this instance, I wouldn't think of resistance to change as an obstacle that you have to skip over. In that case, resistance to change is actually a protective mechanism, because life without the ability to self-soothe is really hard. That means that you might be overwhelmed with all kinds of feelings, or even the smallest things might be able to completely confuse you, overwhelm you, make you dysfunctional and dysregulated. In that instance, when your psyche refuses to change, it's actually protecting itself. I have a lot of respect for resistance to change because of this. Because resistance to change often tells us, before you can get rid of this behavior, you actually need to learn something else. You need to gain new skills. You need to develop something. You need to change something more important within you so that you can give up the symptom. So if you don't have any other ways to self-soothe, and BFRBs are your ways of self-soothing, then you will experience resistance to change. And one way to avoid this form of resistance, or to deal with it, is to simply develop healthy coping mechanisms. So, for example, you can practice techniques like soothe, soften, allow that Christine Neff teaches, and you can find, actually, if you go to her website, selfcompassion.org, you can find a free guided meditation that will teach you how to do this. You can use the RAIN technique, which is also mindfulness-based. It's a technique that I quite like. If you join the BFRB Club, you can have a whole booklet for free on it in PDF. So you can download it and use it. There are many other ways to self-soothe. I like mindfulness-based ways because I practice meditation regularly. I teach meditation. For me, it's a very important part of my life. But of course, for you, it doesn't have to be, and something else may work for you. So before you jump into change, and before you start setting goals about reducing picking or eliminating pulling or whatever, whatever you decide that your goal should be, make sure that you have other ways of self-soothing. So before maybe tackling the symptom itself, you may want to spend some time acquiring healthy coping skills. So when you actually get to the reduction part, when you go back to habit reversal training, it will be easier. Otherwise, let's say that it's hard for you to handle anxiety and you need self-soothing when you feel anxious. If you immediately give up picking or start using your competing response when you need to pick or to pull, what will happen is that you will slowly become more anxious and more tense. And at some point, anxiety or tension may become strong enough that you relapse. A competing response is not a self-soothing mechanism. It's just a replacement habit. So with competing responses and habit reversal, you are not actually aiming to replicate the effect, the psychological and the physiological effect that picking or pulling have. You're simply aiming to replace one habit with another habit. So when you rob yourself of a coping mechanism that way, of course you're going to resist change if that's your only coping mechanism. So level 1 was strategy. Maybe your strategy for changing isn't appropriate for you. Stage, or like the other cluster of resistances, has to do with not having a backup coping skill. So giving up on a behavior without having an alternative to satisfy a need that is truly valid. There is nothing abnormal or strange or bad about needing to self-soothe. This is just something that humans do. And then the third level of resistance is that you may not be ready to change. This may sound like a ludicrous thing to say, because we all know that BFRBs are not just psychologically very difficult, but that they also cause physical problems and things like infections and bald spots, and you may have to wear a wig, or you may even have scars. And then you may think, well, Vladimir, how can you tell me that I'm not actually ready to change? When I'm suffering, I realize that this is a problem. Well, there are several reasons why someone might not be ready to change. First of all, sometimes our lives are such that we have to change many things. And there is something that I like to call change fatigue. When you've changed 3 or 4 or 5 big things in the last couple of years, and then now you still have this skin picking or this hair pulling to get rid of, and there's a part of you that might say, okay, look, maybe I'm really not that bad, and maybe I really don't need to substitute every part of my psychology to be a decent person. So there is that, just being sick of having to change and having to adapt. This is very valid. Luckily, this entire group of resistances, this one is the easiest to deal with, and usually time will take care of it for you. However, in order for change to happen, we also have to see ourselves in a certain way. We have to have certain preconditions, psychologically speaking, so that we are ready to change. We have to be, perhaps, for the lack of a better word, stable enough that we can look at ourselves and not flinch, not run away. We have to be able to accept ourselves for what we are, because I have to be able to look at myself and my problem and say, hey, this is where this problem lies within your entire psychology. This is what its consequences are. This is what it does. This is what you choose to do. This is really not always easy. Acceptance is extremely difficult, but it's also extremely necessary. So if you're struggling to accept yourself, let's say you're a perfectionist, because this is a very common problem. And if you struggle to accept yourself, if you struggle to kind of accept the fact that you have hair pulling, for example, or skin picking, because you expect to see yourself perfect as a perfect person, or you strive to do everything perfectly, and then when you encounter imperfections that you simply have to accept as part of who you are right now, you may be unable to do that. So until you deal with perfectionism, perhaps it'll be hard for you to accept yourself enough to be able to change. Because if you can't acknowledge that a problem is part of who you are, if you keep cutting off the problem and kind of pushing it away from you, not wanting to see it, then how will you change it? I always make this comparison. Imagine that you have a surgeon who is afraid of blood. I mean, one cut, and what happens next? Right? So a surgeon has to be stable enough, has to be flexible enough, has to be prepared for the unexpected, and has to be able to look at blood without flinching, without getting nervous, without looking away. Psychologically speaking, that is what acceptance is. We have to be able to look at ourselves and our problems as part of who we are now. If you have this kind of all or nothing pattern of thinking, you may struggle to do this, because you may think of yourself, well, if I have this problem, then I'm a broken person, and I don't want to be a broken person, so I can't really deal with this problem right now. So sometimes it is really difficult to accept the reality of who we are now. There's how we like to see ourselves and what we actually do in practice. Right? There's what we say that we are, and then how we behave, what choices we make, and what the consequences of our choices are. And these two things don't really have to match up. And when there's a big difference between how you want to see yourself and what you are actually, then you may be tempted to say, I'll just cling to this fantasy of who I am, and reality be damned. Until this discrepancy is resolved, it's really difficult to have anything but resistance to change, because you're not able to kind of see the problem as part of who you are. Once again, this is a place where resistance is actually protective. I would say that overall, in general, I don't want to say that failure to change or resistance to change are necessarily bad things. Sometimes they are defenses. You only have one self-image. If your self-image is rigid, it may need to be changed so that it can encompass your imperfections and your faults and kind of a wider spectrum of behaviors that you actually manifest. But if you only have one self-image, then what are you if you let it go? When changing threatens your sense of identity and your self-image, then of course you're going to resist changing. Because without this image in our minds, an image that tells us who we are, how do we know how to act in the world? How do we know what decisions we need to make? So resistance to change isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's sometimes protective and sometimes worth respecting. It's very interesting. I like to kind of convey this point when I work with people. And then they will say, well, this is just too much for me right now. And I will say, okay, so you're not there yet. That's fine. Let's see where you are. Let's start where you are and what you can do now. And then sometimes people will, move back and say, excuse me, what do you mean I'm not there yet? And to me, this is just observing reality. But because that reality clashes with where a person thinks they are, then we have a little bit of resistance to change. Actually, if you go back to the beginning and what I said, if you can possibly remember everything that I said, what I said about skipping awareness training, because some people think of themselves as being also introspective and self-aware. Sometimes they skip this part of habit reversal precisely because seeing themselves as insufficiently self-aware can be a little threatening. If you think of yourself as being someone who's very self-aware and suddenly you start looking at your behavior and discovering all these feelings and behaviors that you haven't seen before, that means that you have to change how you see yourself because you're not that self-aware as you thought you were. And that can maybe imply that the way you think other people see you isn't really true. Maybe if you see yourself as good at your job, maybe that isn't true either. So suddenly, this one insight has implications for other areas of your life. And they may get to question you, they may get you to question yourself, about who you are in other areas of your life. And suddenly you might think, there's this thing that I do, that I pull my hair sometimes, and suddenly this is leading me to question my identity and who I am as a person. Of course you're going to resist that. So at the same time, resistance is both a protective mechanism, and as such, we have to treat it with respect, but it's also an arrow or maybe a light that's flickering and pointing, there's something wrong here. There's change that needs to be done in this area of your life or in this part of your psyche. When I say that we need to respect resistance, and I promise I'm going to finish now, I don't mean that you need to just back off forever. Once again, it means that you need to be strategic. I will say that whereas I think that you can implement habit reversal training on your own, and I think a lot of BFRB treatment can be done on your own. The whole idea behind the BFRB Club is precisely this, that with a little bit of accountability, with a little bit of guidance for reflection, you can do a lot of it yourself. Dealing with resistance on this level is really hard because a lot of that resistance is unconscious, and it can simply manifest itself as you explaining away that maybe you don't need to change right now, or maybe this Vladimir that's saying all these things, I mean, what the hell does he know anyway? And then you can just move away. That very well could be resistance. And if you don't have someone outside of you to give you a check, to hold you accountable, to interpret this for you, to have dialogue for you, blind spots can remain blind. And then resistance will prevent you from changing, but you will not use it as potential for growth. And that's what resistance has. So resistance on this level of whether you're ready to change or not is perhaps something that's best addressed with a counselor or a therapist or a coach or whatever, your neighbor, if your neighbor can do that, right? So that's basically what I wanted to say. If you feel resistance to change, there are 3 things to pay attention to. Am I making some strategic mistakes? Have I developed appropriate alternative coping mechanisms for whatever it is that picking or pulling provide for me psychologically? And if you skipped awareness training, then it's hard to decide what is it that they provide for you. So go back to the stage 1 of habit reversal training, right? And then the third thing is, am I actually ready to change? Can I see myself with this problem and be okay with it? Can I accept this? not give up on changing. Acceptance just means seeing clearly, remember. So can I see this clearly, be okay with it, and proceed? So that's all I had to say for you today. Hopefully it was not too disorganized, and hopefully you learned something. Ask anything you'd like to know. I'd be happy to help out, and bye-bye until next